we're going to now go, we've only got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go quickly with this introduction for Rochelle. Rochelle Dean is from the Bahamas. She's going to talk to us about effective protection of women's rights. Rochelle is an SME certified project consultant, management professional, and sustainability subject matter and civil society expert. She has over 5 years' experience in global advocacy and international development. She has co-chaired internationally for UN DESA and was sole contributor of the amendments to of the Bahamas Fiscal Responsibility Act. She's also the country contact, or she serves as regional program manager for the Americas of Ananke magazine and is the country contact for Women's Human Rights Campaign Bahamas. Thank you so much, Rochelle, and over to you.
Effective protection of women's rights encompasses utilization of a myriad of conventions that set the standard for policies that regional bodies and organizations apply to meeting critical areas of concern and priority for women. The 1995 Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action sets out these 12 critical areas, including women in poverty, education and training of women, women in health, violence against women, women and armed conflict, women and the economy, and women in power and decision-making, institutional mechanisms for advancement of women, human rights of women, women and the media, women and the environment, and the girl child. These issues highlighted over 20 years ago still present major challenges to the lives of women, particularly those in Africa, hindering peacekeeping, peace building, and post-conflict reconstruction efforts. Still, more needs to be done to address issues of women and poverty, noting that there is a direct link between women's low or lack of economic empowerment and their vulnerability to sexual and gender-based violence, which is exacerbated during times of conflict, as reflected by incidences in countries in Africa's Great Lakes and regions. And so as it relates to the Beijing Declaration, find that, or I find specifically that this specific declaration, along with CEDAW, I'm going to talk about CEDAW for a bit, serves as two separate but unified policy documents that work hand in hand to accomplish its outlined goals for women and girls. In this context, gender, specifically sexual and gender-based violence, addresses women's vulnerability to acts of violence that occur during times of displacement. And so I think it's important to remember that when we speak about gender, even though we have so many things happening in the world and these things become so confusing, it's important to remember that the way that gender is associated or placed in specific policies relative to the United Nations is conducive to gender-based violence, and the fact that this does occur in matters where women are displaced. So even in today's context, or even in what's happening today around the world in countries like the States who didn't ratify certain conventions like CEDAW, it would definitely, this declaration particularly would speak to matters pertaining to women in prison, where women are being violated sexually, as it relates to having these gender neutral spaces that we advocate so heavily to eradicate. And so because of the fact that these areas or these spaces are becoming gender neutral, it leaves an opportunity for women to be violated. And this is where gender-based violence then becomes a matter of concern for women's rights. And so I personally I apply what's happening in countries where women are violently beaten and raped. And it goes back to what we were saying about prisons, but it's imperative that the CEDAW committee and those who apply this convention are held accountable to monitoring the implementation of this platform. And so the platform specifically works with the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination. So it works specifically with CEDAW, and of course, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, often referred to as the Women's Bill of Rights, CEDAW, is significant in the international human rights framework because it exclusively is devoted to equality. CEDAW spells out in detail women's human rights to equality and non-discrimination, and maps out the range of actions that must be taken to achieve this equality. It is one of the core international human rights treaties of the United Nations, and it requires state parties to undertake legal obligations to respect, protect, and fulfill women's human rights. CEDAW is unique among existing human rights instruments because it is concerned exclusively with promoting and protecting women's human rights, and because it operates from the premise that patriarchy is a global reality. Most of the issues in the 12 critical areas of concern in the Beijing Platform for Action are also included in CEDAW, and the CEDAW committee is entrusted with the responsibility of monitoring the implementation of the platform. A government or party that has ratified CEDAW without reservation has also signed onto the Beijing Platform for Action and is doubly committed, first at the policy level and second according to international law. The Platform for Action serves as a tool to address all violations of the rights of women and girls by making women accountable for their own advancement. This resource mechanism helps to set a framework for the key areas highlighted in the platform to achieve many of the critical areas of concern. In this sense, we see where matters pertaining to gender are addressed in the platform to include institutional mechanism for the advancement of women diagnosis. And so we're talking about these specific strategic objectives, which are to create or strengthen national machineries and other governmental bodies, actions to be taken, to integrate gender perspectives in legislation, public policies, programs, and projects, action to be taken, and to generate and disseminate gender disaggregated data and information for planning and evaluation, actions to be taken. Taking into consideration that the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is the basis of the protection on the rights of women, and also incorporates specific articles of the Beijing Platform, specifically relative to matters pertaining to gender, which are not specifically defined in context. We have seen where experts at the policy level have concluded to incorporate gender to address humanitarian and matters of peacekeeping in cultures that may or may not be specifically impacted by certain cultures and/or caste system constructs or exposed to gender-based violence. It is in this sense that the United Nations may be out of touch with grassroots feminists in that policymakers have added language with no definition, as Anna has said, leaving grassroots feminists as well as others to any other such interpretations and notions. There should always be a yin and yang approach to advocacy and activism in order for women's rights to be protected. In that sense, NGOs must be committed to presenting resource mechanisms that help to share unpalatable information while keeping in mind that these resource tools do not minimize accountability. Resources like online campaigns and toolkits are excellent knowledge-sharing avenues for grassroots feminists in their activism. And so, of course, the UN can't force states to agree to any declarations or conventions. So really, activists are really subject to legislators and politicians in terms of setting standards of who shape society and their direction of its socially acceptable norms. So the issue becomes more than context as it relates to language, but the rule of law in specific jurisdictions. And of course, I'm not a lawyer, but we do, it's up to us to set a system, and it's simply, based on common sense. And so I encourage ladies that are watching to sign the declaration, but also to have an understanding that as activists, it's also important that we incorporate both aspects of what CEDAW represents. So CEDAW is, of course, the Convention for Equality, but we also have to look at including the Beijing Declaration as well, because that sets the standard in terms of how certain specific language and the way that words relative to protecting women are placed in the right context. Thank you.